Welcome back after a wonderful lunch. And we are basically embarking with this panel on a series of critical topics that have reached the forefront of attention in peace building. That is local knowledge, local agency, local methods, indigenous methods of peace, everyday peace. And we have certainly 3 experts on those topics. So we will go in order of the schedule with Karina Korostelina first, and then Daniel Agbiboa and Pamina Firchow.
Okay, thank you. I put myself in the most disadvantaged position because I know that your body now really wants to deal with this nice food instead of listening to me. So concentrate, please. For this particular research, I step out a little bit of my usual research agenda of studying of identity-based conflicts and also studying the historic narratives. And why I was very interested in resilience approach, because it's really new approach if you look and really dominating now in peace building agenda. If you look in European Union concept paper for peace building for up till 2020, you will see resilience 40 times and human rights 1. So it's really going into understanding. So of course, this is a new approach which has some negative critic views on it, because some people telling, yes, it shifts responsibility to local communities, maybe because we speak about vulnerabilities and risks. So if there is a huge risk, there is no reason to intervene because risks still will be there. Also, there are a lot of research which shows that resilience can have negative forms. Then gangs are formed to be resilient communities, and there are a lot of connection with, for example, militants within communities to protect themselves. But nevertheless, there are much more positive and promising ideas in resilience approach, because it's really replace what we used to have, this blueprint, this top-down approach, with really concentration of local resources, local practices. It recognizes that communities themselves possess very important values, possess very important knowledge. They already have very developed practices. We just need to work with them, understand them. And it also really promotes local ownership. It promotes local responsibility, joint approach. And what is important, it's really neoliberal approach to governments. So I concentrated on this particular research on disadvantaged neighborhood. Why neighborhood? It's considered like a very small part. But there are a lot of research on fragile states. You know all of this huge body of literature. But there is a now growing body of literature which shows that there are actually pockets of fragility within a state. It could be really stable state, but there are some pockets of fragility which we see in cities like Washington, D.C., in very disadvantaged type of neighborhoods. What is important also that this particular neighborhoods, it's a people, real people, not states, not nations, not ethnic identities, identity group. It's real people who know each other usually very well, and they really accumulate this weight of the world on them. It's open, dynamic, adaptive systems, which is very important for us. But what is very important for my research, it's self-governed and self-organized local actor who produce knowledge, who produces its own practices of resilience. And they really institutional actors which are able to deal with everyday violence, structural, open cultural violences in their spaces. So this is a model which I'm working with. Model include a structure, if you see how structure and dynamic of conflict within these disadvantaged neighborhoods. I'm speaking about urban violence of neighborhoods who experience poverty, gang activities, drug activities, who experience high levels of unemployment. I'm speaking about dynamics of identity and power, and part of the model also external resources. But what I'm exploring, I concentrate on practices. What particular practices do neighborhood create to reclaim their space from perpetrators of violence, from structural violence, and what they actually do and what is effective there. I studied together with 4 undergrad students who were Oscar students for a year and a half. We have studied 4 neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. in collaboration with Neighborhood Association Corporation, who actually hold community centers and community workers there. Semi-structural interviews, participatory observations, and I use phenomenological analysis to make sense of data. So the entire work is already ended in the manuscript. So what I'm presenting today is just one part of it. It's how identity dynamics actually introduced into the process. And just to give you an idea, these neighborhoods have a strong sense of community as a kinship. It's interesting how you can apply kinship, which arrived from ethnic identity studies, into neighborhoods, because this is exactly how they tell about themselves. So everything which study about ethnic identity can be applied for, in particular, unit of, like they organize event, everybody participates, so this is example. Also, I was interested, is there identity groups within the neighborhoods? And apparently are. There are some social boundaries which are clear there. Race, still very important, especially in mixed communities. We speak about new and old Americans, which also have very completely different narratives and different perceptions of each other. It was very interesting. Age was very important, dynamics. And also one of the major narrative of the threat together was relative deprivation of gentrification. We hear a lot of time how gentrification is good for dynamic of the city. What we found in our research together with the students, it's really negative impact on the society because these people really feel threat. They pushed from their communities. They could not afford this new race and beautiful houses, which pushing them out from very old. Each of these communities have long history. So what were sources of legitimacy within these neighborhoods? Again, was very important, interesting for me to see. I saw there are several out-group and in-group. So usually if you read literature, huge amount of literature on legitimacy of church within African American communities, we didn't find it a lot. Only very few people really were speaking how church is important. Prayer was really one of the leitmotif of study of resilience in 1990s, beginning of 2000. But again, in my research and in current research, it's really disappearing. It's very interesting dynamic. A neighborhood management was legitimacy, but was very interesting how legitimacy within the community was. And age, again, very similar, as I told you, a lot of dynamics of ethnicity with older people playing more important role. But also a mother figure was very important part of legitimacy. But also what was really interesting for me, it's ideas of people who overcome difficult paths, former gang members, former drug addicts. They bring in this experience and really impact community. Long residency was very important because it's bringing historic narratives and historic legacy of the community. So this is the people who had legacy and make decisions. I don't have time to show, but this is repertoire of resilience practices to give you just an ideas. For example, cleaning. This was very important idea for self-esteem, that they clean their community. Their community, this gated community, their communities are very different from just you go outside, it's completely different world. It's very clean. Another very important, they're very poor people. Many of them receive minimal payments. But what is really interesting, they have a neighborhood resilience practice and they collect small amount of money, like pencils, something, and send to Kenya. And this is their self-esteem. We're poor, but there are people who are poorer than us, and we can help. It was a very important part. They have neighborhood watches, and they actually close gates at 10 o'clock in the evening and do not allow any youngsters to go out. So there are a lot of very, very interesting practices. What in this particular paper I explored is how practices of resilience connected with the dynamics of identity and legitimacy in neighborhoods. And what I found, there are three mediators, very important mediators there. Coherence, self-esteem, and collective efficacy, which we're working as a very important factors mediating relationship between social identity dynamics and practices. Also, very strong patterns of exclusion and inclusion within these neighborhoods. Some groups have more access to resources. They define resilient practices. They control involvement of resilience practices. And one of the most important, actually, social boundaries within the exclusion and inclusion patterns were age and gender. And the most excluded group is young males. So it was really interesting to see how they almost marginalized in the process of development of community resilience. And it's actually gave opportunity for, I'm working now with Daniel and Arthur. We develop a project exactly how to include these young males in neighborhood resilience practices. And legitimacy of particular groups also play a very important role. And it's really like a spiral. The more legitimate group involved in development of resilience practices, the more they get legitimacy, the more they develop practice. So it's actually leading communities in particular way. It's still good, but we really have to be conscious how resilience is developed based on this particular legitimacy. And of course, it's again, as I told. So what we see here, it's really a systemic approach for it. So then we see community as a system, which exists within the system of society with different institutions, which they rely. I didn't have spoken this here, but in my manuscript, I speaking about connection with different institutions. And also we treat community also as a subsystems of groups which have different identity and legitimacy dynamics, and they also have very different types of relationships with them. So these 4 types of systemic approach to resilience give us opportunity to develop and produce ideas of effective resilience practices where you can build peace one community at a time. Done.
Okay, Professor Agbiboa.
They told control escape. Command escape?
Just escape.
No, doesn't work.
No, it doesn't.
No, no escape.
Thank you, everybody, and my apologies for presenting after lunch. Must be feeling a bit sleepy and the rest. I just want to also join voices with other colleagues who've sort of been sharing their memories of Professor Denise Sandole. I'm very much the youngest of all the professors that came in, but I did have a very interesting experience with Professor Sandole when I came for my job talk, the almighty job talk. So I was supposed to meet with all the faculty members, and one of the faculty members was running late, and so Susan brought me to Professor Sandole and said, would you mind stepping in and talking with me? And he was like, obviously very open to receive me, and we talked a lot and realized we had a lot in common because he was also interested in understanding issues of terrorism and political violence. So that was my sort of little moment or experience with him, and that was to prove to be the last. So going on to today's topic. So The Greek philosopher Aristotle once stated that human beings by nature desire to know. Then you had René Descartes, who would come as the father of modern philosophy, talking about we don't just desire to know, we desire to know that what we know is true and certain. Now, the quest for truth and certainty has been one that has bogged the field of terrorism for a long time. And scholars have talked about, like Mark Sageman have talked about, the problem, the stagnation with terrorism research. Others like Richard Jackson talk about the epistemological crisis of counter-terrorism. And you had others like even Zuleika talking about how counter-terrorism regimes are often characterized by a passion for ignorance, or what he says, a contemplation of nightmares. Now, nowhere is this most visible than in the 9/11 attack. In fact, research on terrorism, how often would you see introductory paragraphs start with since 9/11? It seems to have been almost come to characterize the field of terrorism. But one of the issues that 9/11 brought up was the epistemological crisis. Rich talked about an intellectual crisis. There was an epistemological crisis that characterized the field of terrorism research, and there were questions from the local level about the problem of evil and why such an evil would happen and why people would do what they did. From the state level, there was a sense that we did not know there was a realization that we do not know, and that we certainly do not have certain or true knowledge about a lot of things that are happening. And one of the things that happens when you have a situation of crisis is that people have anger, all sort of feelings and frustrations, and there's always a tendency to displace those anger and frustration or aggression and try to put it down to something. What emerges from this 9/11 sort of soul searching was a tendency to construct what Bryn Smith calls a suspect community. And the suspect community, as you would guess, was often the Muslim community, as you would argue, the Arabs, or people that look like me, essentially. And this, again, can be underpinned by what Zuleika calls the passion for ignorance. There was a sense that we need to so once you construct a suspect community, which draws on Benedict Anderson's sort of imagined community, they're often communities that you haven't met or even had any personal sort of relations with, but nonetheless, you sort of categorize them and put them into this suspect category. What emerges from this suspect community is a legitimization of the use of violence against them. It's a dehumanization of those who are part of those suspect community, but also note how the suspect community draws on a passion for ignorance or a lack of knowledge. And it's often based on an imagined community. People feel so strongly about people that they don't even know, have not met on a one-to-one level. So this is what happened at the bigger level. I want to use this sort of frame to understand and contextualize, and all through the morning we've talked a lot about the US, but as one of the commentators said, there are many things happening in other parts of the world as well. So I would like to reconfigure the margins in that sense. So one of the things a suspect community does is that it alienates people, whether it's young males or young females. It alienates people. And in that alienation, people feel a sense of bondedness to each other. And so they bond together to do something about their alienation. And this is the feeling that comes up. Now, what I want to do is to contextualize that in the region that I work in, which is the northeastern Nigeria, which also borders the Lake Chad Basin. The Lake Chad Basin is a very interesting region. Lake Chad used to be the biggest lake in the world in the 1960s, but it's shrunk about 90% of its size. In a region where people are typically fishermen or farmers and depend on the waters of the lake for their livelihood and their source. And this, again, has to be understood in the context also of the Boko Haram crisis that has now emerged to further complicate the situation. So what has happened is that farmers, fishermen have tended to move with the shrinking lake, further blurring any distinctions between those boundaries. And that has resulted in a lot of conflict that is often underreported or not even reported at all. So the Boko Haram crisis is one that I have followed for a long time, since about 2012, when the crisis, the conflict transformed into an insurgency. Now, one of the issues that happened was with the Boko Haram crisis, and from the point of view of the state intervention, is that soldiers who were sent to this northeastern region to deal with this Boko Haram insurgency often did not have local knowledge of the context. They could not speak the local language. They had never been to the region. They did not have a sense of the geography. And so when they came into these places, they typically saw the categories that Karina talked about. The young male were typically the ones who were the suspect community. They were likely to be the foot soldiers of these terrorist groups. Also, they presumed, because everybody dressed in a similar kind of way, wearing a turban, that they looked like the terrorists, the Boko Haram terrorists. And since it was a kind of guerrilla warfare where the lines between militants and civilians were often blurred, they also presumed, they drew a false moral equivalence between the local community and the Boko Haram community. And so in creating that suspect community, they legitimized the use of violence against these people. And this is well documented in reports by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the like. But that's not the focus, because that's often what gets the attention. What I want to look at is a group of people who are the civilians, who are often caught between terrorism and counter-terrorism. Now, if you look at the pictures of success, which is often declared in the news in Mosul and Raqqa, the rebels are often depicted as the success who have defeated ISIS. What is often missing from this analysis is the tendency to view civilians as passive victims of this conflict. And so what I want to do is to try to reclaim a bit of the agency, the local agency that Karina was talking about, and to look at particular youth groups who emerged from the same city where Boko Haram emerged from, city of Maiduguri, have also been victimized by the state, the same way that the youth of Boko Haram felt victimized by the state, but have taken a stance not for Boko Haram, but for the same state that victimizes them, to work with the state to counter this group. So what I'm looking at is not the typical hope against the state, which is often labeled on young people, but the young people who are dying to save, not to kill. Young people who are hoping for a better state and to work within the state. So these groups, again, you talk about neighborhood watch. In Nigeria and much of West Africa, the typical term is the vigilantes. They form vigilante groups and they work with the state to sort of counter terrorism. This was a picture taken from a field work, and you have youth like this, and this is what they crest in their shirt: fight terror, keep the peace. And what they do is to try to expand the surveillance capacities of the state, become the eyes and ears of the state. But these are also very tactical youth who, in a context of unemployment and insecurity, they're trying to align themselves with the state in the hope of post-conflict sort of jobs. Obviously, getting a job as a soldier or a military person is a very stable sort of job where you can get money. So these young people are also trying to negotiate their precarious sort of livelihoods and trying to find ways in which they can socially become in the local context. So these are ways in which they do that. But what you also see with these young people in terms of networks is that although Boko Haram emerged from an urban context, a city context, with the rise of this group of people who know the context and claim that what the state lacks is a local contextualized knowledge. So we will provide that as the eyes on the street for the state. So we'll work with the state. But you've also had this urban youth, as they pushed Boko Haram out of the city with their knowledge. And this is important because there were women who were part of it, and women often granted legitimacy to the work of the young men. Now, often women often come into the literature as, even when scholars try to assert the agency of women, it's always as women as agents of suicide terrorism. But we never look at the positive agency of women who come into the literature to try to counter terrorism. These women actually are the first people who occupy the most dangerous positions. They go into house-to-house searches because a man cannot be isolated with a woman in northeastern Nigeria, many of the, and in the Lake Chad Basin. So they grant legitimacy to the work of these vigilante this vigilante group. But another important thing that I want to highlight is the ways in which, as they pushed Boko Haram out of these urban areas, the group moved into the countryside and the forest. What this group did is that they linked up with local hunters. If they claim to have a certain knowledge of the local localities and the neighborhoods, the local hunters claim to have knowledge of the forest. They see themselves as custodians of the bush. So they linked up with these rural-based local hunters and worked with them to counter terrorism. And for many villagers that I spoke to, some of them have never even seen the Nigerian police or the Nigerian army. All they know is about local hunters or these vigilante groups. So it's what this does in the broader literature then is to try to reshape this, to move away beyond imposing a sort of Weberian sort of division between state and society, to analyze some parts of these West Africa and the Lake Chad Basin, and so we can look at what emerges, which I call hybrid local security assemblages or hybrid security governance. How state and non-state actors work together to govern space, and how that can be, going forward, a counterbalance to these eyes in the sky, which the US often uses, the drones, which cannot really distinguish between the militants and civilians on the ground, where you need the local knowledge. Otherwise, repeat the same mistake that the Russians had when they moved into Grozny and underestimated the local people, and the Chechnyan forces actually were very keen. They had the localized knowledge, and so they were able to mingle among the local Groznian population and use that to sort of push back against the Russians. So what I'm advocating essentially in this paper is a reconfiguration of surveillance techniques to include eyes on the street as a counterbalance to eyes on the sky, and to look at ways in which state and society can work together to govern space.
Thank you very much. Professor Firchow.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I want to start by thanking Karina for putting this together, this much needed conference together. And I really do hope that we'll be able to turn this into the Sandole Research Symposium, the annual Sandole Research Symposium. I think this is so important to bring our community together and really share what we're all working on, and have graduate students engaging with our research. So today I'm going to present in as quickly as I can. Like Solon said, this is a 50-minute, hour-and-a-half presentation, which I will condense in 12 minutes. So I will speak fast as well. The book is a slice of a larger project that's on participatory numbers and everyday peace indicators that I've been working on since 2012. And that project has had funding and has now expanded to 3 continents and 10 countries, where we're working both in measurement in terms of improving measurement on difficult to define concepts like peace and reconciliation, and others, more macro measurement initiatives, but then also looking at how we can improve monitoring and evaluation systems, so actual program management and project development. So let's see. The talk is, and the talk and the book are organized into 2 parts. First, there's a conceptual reflection about measurement issues in peace and conflict studies, and that covers how we currently measure peace and related phenomena, and the challenges with measuring these difficult to define concepts. And it also introduces the everyday peace indicators approach, and gives a detailed overview of how the everyday peace indicators address these challenges, as well as how, like the actual process of how the everyday peace indicators are applied. And then the book also uses the everyday peace indicators in 2 experimental designs, research designs in Uganda and Colombia, to say something about local peace building effectiveness. And so I'm going to go through this, and we'll briefly touch on a few of those points in my presentation. So here we go. The guiding questions, which are mainly about measurement difficulties and concepts like peace, but also how we can measure peace effectively in a way that reflects priorities and needs of populations that we're striving to serve. So I attend to this question of how can we measure peace effectively, but how can we also be sure that that's reflected of those local communities. And I recognize that it is important to include actors at all levels. But the literature and arguably also practice have focused more on elite levels interactions until recently. And so my focus is more at the local level. So there are plenty of existing approaches to measuring peace, although many of them are focused more on measuring violence and war. So there's a long history of measuring armed conflict dating back to the 1950s and arguably even earlier, and initiatives to also generate databases and other ways of coding violent events into databases in order to say things about armed conflict and war, and then consequently peace. And these are just some examples. Typically, the approach of creating those measurement systems is very top-down. So regardless of whether you're trying to create an index or you're trying to create an evaluation tool, it tends to be focused on panels of experts who work to define a concept, because in order to be able to measure something, definition is necessary. Generally speaking, those concepts, in order to say something about a bigger space, need to be generalized. And then indicators are identified in order to be able to develop questions and collect data. So this is problematic for some, and the approach to a top-down measurement and definition of concepts that comes more from a positivist perspective is often criticized, or at least interpretivists find themselves uncomfortable with this approach to truth, right? Interpretivists believing that truth is relative, whereas positivists see truth as more measurable. Now, this is very extreme, and I realize that. I think that I like to think of this in a binary, because it helps to understand the tensions between interpretivists and positivists, but I recognize that there is gray. But my approach really is an effort to try to bring the two together. So the everyday peace indicators use participatory action research, hold on, sorry, there we go, to source indigenous technical knowledge. Indigenous technical knowledge being the knowledge that, that individuals use in their communities, and that information or that knowledge can manifest itself in many different ways. I gather it or collect it through a process of asking people to identify indicators in their daily lives. And in that process, I ask them to produce or to produce those indicators on which one can produce participatory numbers and participatory statistics, which I'll go over in a minute if I have time. So I'm just going to go past this here. So just to do a very brief overview of the everyday indicator process, we do this through focus groups and participatory action research. So usually when we think about participatory action research, we think of qualitative methods. But what we're actually doing here is not just collecting qualitative data, but we're collecting data that will then be produced into numbers. So it's mixed method. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A, but it's focus groups, and there's also a verification process where we then have a final list of indicators that are representative of a community. And some examples of everyday peace indicators, there are a multitude, as you can imagine. I've chosen some from the book project. Can the Boda Boda cyclists ride to certain areas is one. Boda Boda cyclists being taxis in northern Uganda. And this one, I like to use it because it's really telling of also the post-conflict networks in northern Uganda, where a lot of Boda Boda cyclists are actually ex-combatants and very plugged into the post-conflict network. So they really have a sense of, where to go, where not to go, et cetera. And these indicators that are then sourced in the communities, right? So the community members are generating these indicators. I have nothing, obviously the facilitator has a role in this process. But I'm trying to gather their indicators in order to systematically then organize them and be able to say something about peace in their communities. And in order to do that, I also code the indicators into categories, because these indicators are often so very myopic and reflective of a very specific issue within the community, which can tell you a lot for maybe programming purposes, or for perhaps if you're concerned with a specific issue within that community, but it doesn't tell you a lot about trends or within communities. So categorization is helpful. So the book deals with, as I said, quasi-experimental design in 2 communities, and I'm just going to very quickly go over the quasi-experimental design, which is, and I'm using the case of Colombia, of 2 communities in Colombia, to give you an idea, a taste of what's going on in the book. There's 2 communities, Don Gabriel and El Salado. Don Gabriel, they are demographically as similar as possible, have similar histories of violence, but the big difference being is this is Don Gabriel, that is the level of intervention. So Don Gabriel has had, since the violent events and displacement, so that's also key, is that both were completely displaced. Basically 3 interventions, mostly government focused. Oh my goodness. This is always my problem. I always go over time. Whereas El Salado has had an enormous amount of intervention, you can see here, and I won't go into any of this, but over 120 actors, right? And so so this is the research design. Doing the everyday indicators allows us to, in these communities, allows us to say something about the differences. And so I won't even go into much of the findings, but you can see from the survey analysis, because we did surveys in the communities based off of the indicators, that localities that were saturated, so these findings are for the study in general, not just these two communities. Localities saturated with high levels of interventions do not have substantially higher levels of peacefulness, according to the community-generated indicators of peace. So that results really suggests that there's a disparity, right, between what communities need and prioritize and the interventions that are happening in their communities. And then another big, here we go, conclusion was that was when that really surprised me, which was that an increase in interventions increased the level of observed development. Makes sense. There was, in communities where there was a large amount of development, people observed the development, but it also increased the level of perceived insecurity. And so it suggests that with an increase of development, there's an increase of insecurity in communities, that development brings insecurity. And I, from the indicator analysis, also find that much of this has to do with the fact that there is a prioritization of social issues within these communities. Socially related indicators, indicators that have to do with conflict resolution, are incredibly prioritized in these communities, and they are not, and those kinds of programs are not prioritized by external actors. And there are other conclusions that I come to as well, but I won't go over those right now, but I'm happy to talk to you about them afterwards.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Our discussants for this panel are Emily Sample and Chukwuma Onyia. So, Emily, do you want to go first?
Well, first of all, thank you all so much for these incredibly interesting papers, and I really look forward to digging into them a little bit. So first, just looking at some overarching themes, I thought it was really interesting that at first blush, these kind of didn't connect. And then as I read through them, I really found them finding very similar conclusions at different levels. So just going through in the same order that you guys spoke, Dr. Korostelina's paper really brought home to me this idea of urban community. And I think that one of the things that was defined well in your paper was what community meant to these people, because it was very much self-definitional. And I think that came through in all three of these papers as well. My question, having read all three of the papers and making these connections, is looking at external intervention and kind of bringing in what Dr. Firchow was talking about into those urban communities. We focused quite a bit on the idea of cleaning the community. Who's supporting that? My thought process was, where is that financial support coming from? And if there is external intervention, how is it integrated into how the community sees itself and their relationship? And then the other thing I found very interesting in Dr. Korostelina's paper is the idea of gender and age and that interplay, and how that might connect to this generational divide between what you described as African American versus the first generation African American versus the Latinx community. So if you would be willing to speak more on that, I found that conclusion very interesting, and this exclusion of young men. And one thing, just kind of tangentially, that you touched on quite a bit in the paper, but I didn't see in the presentation, was this community's relationship to the police. And I thought that especially with the presentations this morning and talking about our current situation in the United States, how is that relationship to the police growing or changing? Which leads me to Dr. Agbiboa's paper, which I really enjoyed. I thought it was a really interesting way of looking at the community, and I think this idea of suspect community is very current in what we're looking at, both in Nigeria and here at home. And my question for you was, again, on gender, looking at, I was interested in this idea of the sons and daughters of the soil, and how, and you touched on it briefly in the presentation, but I was interested in how women are intersecting with this, and if they are, how they are, I guess, that same motherhood narrative as well. And then just to wrap things up, I kind of saw, Dr. Firchow, your paper as almost an umbrella over these two cases. I really enjoyed this concept of big P and small p peace building. And I thought that was a really interesting way of connecting with the international intervention and assistance. And my question for you is more focused on what we're doing here is, what does it mean for teaching about peace building? If we are focusing on local indicators, is there any way to generalize? How can we continue to have schools here in the West and then connect them if we're focusing only on the local, and how is that possible? And just for all three of you, how did your positionality influence this research? I know that 2/3 of our panel here are not local, talking about local connections. So just how do you connect that, and how or if does it affect your research? So thank you.
I am so much impressed, and I learned a lot reading your papers. For me, it's an eye-opener in many ways, particularly when I read Pamina Firchow's work. It actually has a lot to say in our practice, in our field, having to actually integrate the locals and seek for, just like Daniel said, seek for local content knowledge that may elude researchers. Of course, I understand that we all have this knowledge, theories and other things, but locals understand some knowledge we don't have, even when we have the theories. And that is why where I enjoyed your work so much. And it amazed me how you were able to reach out to the locals in many ways. Rather than bringing your theories, you allow them bring from their own local content, scoop the data that eventually you use for the survey. And that, for me, when I saw that, I was thinking about probably I'm going to design my thesis in this format. And it's very, very interesting. And coming to your work, Daniel, one thing stood out. Yes, Nigerian police made a mistake initially, like I told you in my discussion with you, that Nigerian state, up until 2013, had no national policy framework on counter-terrorism. And that's why they made some of the mistakes they made. And again, bringing in the youth as part of the counter-terrorism measures or framework in the state, it worked a lot well, pretty well. But like you did observe in one of your papers, the coming anarchy. And like you also alluded in your presentation, that some of these boys went into this in hope for a return, probably an employment afterwards. The challenge I would have is, how is the state, when I say the state, I'm talking about Nigerian state, currently navigating with these demands of these youths and the future security, because it's very, very important. If the state doesn't handle it properly well, this youth could eventually become the next anarchy, like you observed. And it's important we bring this out, because if we don't do that, probably the next research will be on how to handle this. So our research agenda should also have to address that. And I hope to see how that is handled. And for Dr. Korostelina, it is interesting when I read your paper, because coming as how you brought in the state fragility. Well, nobody would think that state fragility is also in America. It's all about third world. But the way you brought it, I liked it so much. And one thing that is across board your papers is the locals, how they bond together, how their marginality made them to bond together among themselves, to help themselves, and build for themselves that resilience needed to overcome conflict situations. It's very, very interesting how you brought it in your paper, and that for me is a wonderful thing. Thank you.
Okay, so we have time now for discussion. Oh, yes, of course, sorry, yes.
Very quickly for this, thank you very much for both comments and questions. Very quickly, so the communities I did research in, they really affected by, that DC was a murder capital for many years, and it's still very high level of crime, while it's really actually reducing for the last several years. Statistics is very, very good for the last few years, but still these areas are very affected by strong poverty, by gang activities, drug infestation, so there are a lot of this. But these particular communities, were able to reclaim their space from perpetrators of violence, from structural violence, and so on. And we really think about your question about what sources, what money, what resources needed. Actually, many practices they do are self-sustained and self-produced, which is very, very important because it's really helping them to create this, what was really important for me is very important, this idea of self-efficacy or self-esteem, that we can do it. But also there is a huge amount of different NGOs, the government agencies, non-government agencies, which are working to help. And one of the issues which we are working now with DC government, and that there are more programs that the people know about. So how to let them know about all these programs which are available. There are a lot of resources. I have an entire chapter just on local resources available to them. This exclusion and divide is very important. You think it's like very homogeneous community, almost 2 of them were very homogeneous. But you still see very interesting divide, and you're right, one of the interesting for me divide was between first generation African American and longer who live there. And what was really put in from the narratives is this importance of education and comparative experience. Majority of African American who just arrived as the first or second generation, their parents came because they were seeking education or because they were seeking jobs in the United States. They had experience going from many countries. They value education, so important. And actually, this is a group who in every single community who lead the summer schools, after school programs, they did like camps, whatever. So they really bring education into community and elevated children so much that the graduation rate in this community is really rising right now, which is very, very important. And police, I was very, very pleased, at least what I see, that they collaborate with police. Police is welcome. Actually, 2 communities even provide their community centers for meetings of local police. They have programs with police and children. Police have like give children, young children, they give them honorable positions or something like this. So they work with police always present and neighborhoods welcome police. This was very interesting for me to see again this 4 neighborhoods which were very successful reclaiming their space. It's also very much based on very positive relationships.
Yeah, thank you, Emily and Chukwuma, for the questions. Just, Emily, back to your point on the role of women, which I'm currently now doing a manuscript on. What my work does show is to try to understand how situations of conflict is beginning to alter the traditional roles of women in society. So typically in northeastern Nigeria, in predominantly Muslim region, women were often supposed to be indoors, hardly seen outside. But with Boko Haram targeting young men who joined a lot of these vigilante groups to work with the state and fighting against them, a lot of them have lost their husbands. And they've also seen their source of livelihood, which also often lies with the husband, gone. So they've been sort of compelled to come out and change and rewrites that whole narrative of women being domestic, being at home. And so it strikes you when you go to Maiduguri, which is the heartland of the insurgency, to see women holding guns and women holding daggers and knives. This was not something people could imagine, just a few years back. So conflict inadvertently is altering the roles of women in society and forcing the male in the society to begin to rethink what is going on in that places. But what is also important in the same sense is that some of the women who were part of these vigilante groups, when the men spoke of them, they always talked about our wives or our women. There was a sense of ownership of what they were doing. It was always, we send them out. We know, we use them as a weapon against these terror groups. So there was also that very interesting dynamic or sense of ownership of whatever activities these women were doing, we own them. But there are also the various ways of agency where Boko Haram were actually paying bride price. The whole issue on politics of bride price was a fascinating thing. Until Boko Haram emerged in that context, when women hardly received anything from the bride price. The family sort of appropriated a lot of those things. What the group did is they come in and they love the communities and paid directly the women the bride price. So they felt that it was empowering them. And a lot of women I met had actually divorced their men and went to marry Boko Haram men. And they told me, frankly, that we felt we were better taken care of. We felt like queens. And so it's no surprise then that some of the Chibok girls that were released, a significant number decided to go back and go and join their husbands because they felt they were treated better. The society there was much better. So it's interesting, some of the things I'm exploring now. On the whole aspect of the coming anarchy, it's something I've had to pause. I know I put forward that proposition, but in a very interesting way, I've had to rethink that again. Studying these young people, they came in under situations of crisis and decided to work with the state, even when it could have been more lucrative to work with Boko Haram. Boko Haram in a state, a country where the majority survive on less than $1 a day, Boko Haram were paying these people over $100. So it's just a no-brainer to go on the path of the state. But they've proven that they could emerge and work with the state to try to counter terrorism. I wonder why we always engage with youth from a position of fear and a coming anarchy. This is a critique of my own self that I've had to undergo. Why can't we? They have shown first that they can operate from a position of a lot of good, and we can work with the good. After all, Mandela says it comes easier to the human mind to love than to hate. So this is something that I have to rethink. So my own work, and I'll just leave that there. Yeah.
I guess to respond to your question about generalization, and thank you for both your comments and questions. So the generalization question is one that I get a lot from when I make this presentation on the everyday peace indicators or the everyday indicators, is from political scientists and from policymakers. They want to know, is this applicable to larger context than just a village or a neighborhood? And the short answer is, we'll see. So for sure, the process of generalization means that nuance and detail will be lost. But there are things that can be gained, and in particular, measurement validity and more expansive bottom-up representation of measurement. And so I have an interest in it and have decided to pursue that interest. And right now we are piloting a methodology that I've developed with two statisticians, two colleagues who we put together a paper on scaling up the everyday indicators. And we're piloting this in Nariño, which is another department in Colombia that borders on Ecuador. And what's really interesting about it is what we're trying to do is we're working with, there was a group of indigenous activists that approached us after the peace accord was signed in Colombia, and that we're just concerned with the implementation of the peace accord and whether or not the implementation was in their interest and was really going to have an impact on their community. And so we decided to work with this, with one of these indigenous groups, the Pasto indigenous group, to try to develop a bottom-up barometer and to be able to measure the impact and measure the implementation of the peace accord according to their own indicators. And so to create an indicator system of an entire indigenous group is quite complex, as you can imagine, especially since these indicators are so localized and often geographic, right? Often are more specific to a locality than they are necessarily to being a member of an indigenous group, and to identity issues. I mean, it's a mixed bag. So we are looking at how we can most effectively scale this up to be able to say something about a larger group. Now, I don't think that we'll ever be able to do an index of a country, for example. But my hope is that we can rigorously do a scaling up of the indicators so that we can really say, okay, this is representative of at least a group or maybe of a region.
Okay, we have time for some questions, and may I ask the questioners to please stand up as you speak?
Thank you very much for the wonderful papers. Professor Karina, I was wondering if you will describe resilience as a form of hegemonic strategy. And then if that is the case, how would you describe that process with the kind of prism through which groups construe their reality, which is, which can also be described as a form of social-psychological infrastructure that Danielle Bartel talked about. Thank you.
Maybe let's collect three.
Three on this side, and go ahead. Briefly, then quickly, I'm interested in, we have this phrase, think globally, act locally, and yet all of you are, and I think Mara earlier today was trying to help us think locally too. And I think that's been a missing step for us, and so I applaud that turn in this panel. Question specifically for Pamina, your slide of El Salado, once you started putting the 120 interveners, El Salado was not visible itself. And I just thought that image that so many interveners that actually covers up El Salado kind of makes your point in some way. But the question for you is the reference to these different local indicators of peace. As I understood, then you jump from that to, well, these are the interventions that people want, and we can shape from that what interventions are more locally meaningful. And I just want to question it seems to me the drivers of conflict are different than the indicators of peace. And that we could have, I guess, places I've seen a local indicator of peace of, if stones are piled up on the roofs, that means people are getting ready for war or maybe ready to throw the stones. Like that's a local indicator in this one village. Doesn't mean that removing stones from roofs will fix the conflict, right? And so that's an indicator without being a driver of. And so I wanted to see have you looked at ways of looking at everyday understandings of the drivers of the local conflicts, because there is local knowledge there too, I think.
This comment or this question is for Daniel. I'm interested in the use of youth from hunter societies. I worked in Sierra Leone at the end of the war, and the civil defense forces, the hunter societies, saved the government, and the resources given to that area of the country were statistically far higher than anywhere else. But on the other hand, there were some negative aspects to the activities of those particular groups, and I'm wondering, And that still carries forward today. And there's the spiritual aspects, and I'm not sure if the spiritual aspects apply to these groups here, but I'd be interested either offline or at some point to hear about that. But with the surveillance, what are the dangers of surveillance in civilian hands? What are the dangers of surveillance in government hands, of course? But the interaction and transaction that can occur from that could be problematic.
Daniel, this one's for you too. So I was thinking about, or have been thinking a lot about the relationship between violent actors and the communities they claim to represent, right? And in the scenario in which you're talking about, or case you're talking about, you really have two sets of violent actors, both claiming to represent the same community, or at least aspects of that same community. So I'm curious if you saw tensions between the nonviolent supporters of the two violent factions within that community. Were there tension between the nonviolent actors that mirrored potentially some of the tension that was happening between the violent actors?
We need to finish by 45. So I'm still like doing time management. No, really. So sorry for me being a watchdog today. Very quickly again, 2 minutes. I study in this particular research. I study resilience in a situation of urban violence, but it definitely can be what framework I'm developing with the model is really resilience in situation of chronic violence. And what you can see, for example, this local identity, how it's extremely important, especially if you look in Middle East. The idea of national identity is not working. Look at Syria, it doesn't work there. Ethnicity will not work, but locality, identity of locality. There is a very interesting research coming right now about how small cities reclaim their space from the war. They build peace within the cities. And there is even research to see how much they speak about different identities, and the only identity which really matters for them is their local identity, because this is how people feel about themselves. Assad was thinking not about Syria, he was thinking about just his particular city where he is from. The same in Afghanistan, this local ownership, then people really able to reclaim their own space. Nilafar Saki is defending her dissertation within a month, I hope. And she speaks a lot about this local ownership in Afghanistan, which is more important than the idea of national identity or ethnic identity. For me, it's very important. I always studied national ethnic identities. For me, this elevation of locality is very important part of production of knowledge, production of reality, construction of reality is very, very interesting.
Just quickly to your first point there. I think most times when we talk about youth, we use the word exclusion and inclusion. And I always find it problematic because I think most of the time the issue is not whether people are included or excluded, it's how they are included. In a way, they can be included in a way that does damage to themselves. And this is particular to this youth. They are included in the government sort of counter-insurgency network. But what they are more concerned is the way in which they are treated within their inclusion. Whereas people see them as part of the government, but they're not paid well, they're not treated properly, and this is their complaints, which leads me to question whether we should be moving away from the concept of inclusion or exclusion to adverse incorporation, the way in which people are incorporated and how it does damage to them. The issue of spirituality, I'm looking at an article now on magic and warfare. What was very interesting was that a lot of these people they believed in a lot of magics that they told me were embedded in their skulls. They showed me all sort of parts, and they said that some of this magic makes them disappear in front of Boko Haram insurgents. So when they actually, and the local people believe in it. I don't care whether other people think it doesn't make sense. That's nonsense for me. Insofar as the local people believe in it, and even the Boko Haram people, they say, some of the Boko Haram suspects that were caught, they said they were actually scared of this young man because they actually believe that if you have a young man with a stick chasing after us with an AK-47, and this was what was happening. These guys were with sticks and chasing these people out of the community. But they actually succeeded, and in my degree, you can go there now because, Boko Haram has been chased away from the community, and it's directly an action of these local people with local knowledge, with a sense of magic, whatever you describe it. And that ties to Julie's question then about the violent, non-violent. But Boko Haram, they have also suffered because civilian targeting has become, you know, a critical aspect. And Calivers and other scholars have sort of conceptualized this, where they talk about how as groups begin to lose grounds, they will move from insurgency to terror. Terror is a weapon of the weak. As they begin to gain grounds, they would turn on these very communities. A lot of these young men have been targeted by Boko Haram to the extent that in checkpoints and the rest, I often saw these young men wearing masks, covering their faces, all these fancy masks, in order to hide or hide their identity. But you know, some of them I talked to said they were not hiding their identity. The mask wearing was actually reclaiming their identity, and it was a sense of masculinity and toughness. But really interesting aspect.
Thanks, Susan, for the question. Just quickly, I mean, another one of my findings was that the multidimensionality of peace, right? How multidimensional peace is at a local level, specifically, and for locals. And so, drivers of conflict, I mean, I think they were represented within indicators of peace as well. Because if you think about it, I mean, these indicators are very, very localized, and they're very much the part of the day-to-day within these communities. They're also very much something that we do everywhere. We do it here as well. This kind of subconscious understanding of what are the signs that we look to in our daily lives to determine whether we are more or less at peace, right? What are those things that we look to? And those are incredibly multidimensional, and can be everything from what we understand as positive peace to what we understand as negative peace, and from drivers of conflicts to other dimensions of peace. I'm actually working on another paper on a project that we did in Afghanistan in Nangarhar and Kunar districts on indicators of violent extremism. And that's where we really looked very specifically also at drivers of violent extremism at the local level.
We have run out of time for this panel. Obviously, extremely rich and deep insights that have come out. I encourage everybody to look at the PowerPoint presentations or papers, obviously from this panel and many others, and continue the conversation. Thank you very much. Thank you for the panelists.